Robert Kiyosaki wants you $1 million in debt. That's the actual philosophy behind one of the best-selling personal finance books ever written. And if that sounds insane to you, you were raised the same way most people were. Debt is dangerous, debt is shameful, debt is the thing you spend your whole life trying to escape. Rich Dad, Poor Dad was originally self-published back in 1997, and since then it has sold upward of 44 million copies. It reshaped how an entire generation thinks about money. And right at the center of that reshaping is one idea: that debt isn't inherently bad. That the rich use debt as a tool, and the rest of us just fear it. Here's what this video is about. The book gets that part right. Debt really can work for you. But there's a layer underneath that framework that Rich Dad, Poor Dad barely touches, and that's what I want to get into today. Because understanding the good debt versus bad debt idea is only half the picture. The other half is what the book quietly glosses over, and it's the part that has actually wiped people out. By the end of this, you'll have both halves. And there's one thing in particular, about how leverage actually behaves in the real world, that I want to save for last, because it changes how you should think about everything else. First, let's talk about the two dads, because the whole book is built on this contrast. The poor dad is Kiyosaki's biological father, a highly educated college professor. The rich dad is Kiyosaki's best friend's father, a wealthy entrepreneur who owns dozens of businesses. Both dads give conflicting advice on money. The poor dad believes you should work for money as a salaried employee at a stable job, and that your wealth largely depends on your background. The rich dad thinks completely differently. He believes the goal isn't to earn money, it's to make money work for you. And the single biggest difference between how these two men operated wasn't income, and it wasn't intelligence. It was how each one thought about debt and assets. Think about what that actually means for a second. Two people with access to the same banks, the same loan products, the same interest rates, and one of them treats debt like a disease while the other treats it like raw material. The poor dad's instinct was always to pay things off, stay clean, avoid risk. And on the surface, that sounds responsible, because we're all told that's responsible. But the rich dad's instinct was to ask a completely different question. What can I use this money to build before I have to give it back? That mental shift is the whole engine of the book, and it's genuinely worth sitting with before you move on to the mechanics. So here's the definition that makes the whole thing click. An asset is anything that puts money into your pocket, like a bond or a house you purchase and rent out to other people. A liability is anything that costs you money because it loses value over time, like an expensive car or a television set. Simple enough, right? But here's where it gets interesting. Under this definition, your house, the thing you live in, the thing you were probably told your whole life is your biggest asset, is actually a liability. It costs you every month. The mortgage, the taxes, the maintenance. Money flows out, not in. That's not an asset in Kiyosaki's framework. That's a liability wearing an asset's clothes. And that reframe, once it lands, is genuinely hard to shake. It's one of those ideas that feels almost obvious in hindsight, but quietly dismantles something you've believed your whole life. Most people grow up being told that owning a home is the cornerstone of financial security. Parents say it, financial advisors say it, the culture just assumes it. And Kiyosaki walks in and says, well, actually, if it's costing you money every month and not generating any, it's a liability by definition. The house you live in doesn't pay your mortgage. You do. The house a landlord rents to someone else? That one has a shot at being an asset because someone else is covering the costs and potentially leaving something over. It's the same object, a house, doing two completely different financial jobs depending on how you use it. Once you see that distinction, you start looking at everything you own differently. So now the framework makes sense. Kiyosaki categorizes debt into good debt and bad debt, with good debt being that which helps build wealth, such as loans used for acquiring income-generating assets like real estate, businesses, or investments. Bad debt, by contrast, funds things that lose value and drain you every month. Car loans, credit card balances, consumer spending. Good debt funds something that pays you back, ideally more than the debt costs you. That's the whole mechanic. And when you lay it out that simply, it really does make sense. If you borrow money at 5% interest and the thing you bought with that money returns 8%, you've made 3% on money that wasn't even yours to start with. That's leverage working in your favor. The debt isn't a burden, it's the mechanism. Here's what it looks like in practice. Say you buy a rental property with a mortgage. You put some money down, the bank covers the rest, and then a tenant moves in and pays rent every month. If that rent covers your mortgage payment and still leaves something over, you're cash flow positive. The tenant is essentially paying off your loan while you build equity in an asset. The debt isn't costing you. It's working for you. That's the aha the book is selling, and honestly, as a concept, it's solid. The math checks out. The logic is real. And you can see why it resonated so hard with so many people. For someone who grew up being told to pay off debt as fast as possible and avoid borrowing at all costs, this idea feels almost transgressive. Like you've been handed a cheat code that everyone else was too scared to use. A tenant covers your mortgage while your property appreciates. You build equity without spending your own paycheck to do it. The bank essentially becomes a silent partner funding your wealth. On paper, it's elegant. And in the right conditions, it genuinely works exactly the way the book describes. But here's what the book leaves out. And this is the part that actually matters. The book describes good debt like it's a system. Like if you follow the logic, the outcome is predictable. Buy the asset, cover the debt with income from the asset, build wealth. What it doesn't spend much time on is what happens when the income stops. Because leverage doesn't care about your intentions. It only cares about cash flow. And when cash flow disappears, leverage doesn't pause. It accelerates in the wrong direction. Your tenant stops paying. The property sits vacant for 4 months. You hit an unexpected repair. Interest rates shift, and your variable rate climbs. Any one of those things can flip a cash flow positive property into something that's bleeding you dry every single month. And because you use debt to buy it, you can't just walk away quietly. The bank has a claim on it. The debt keeps coming whether the income does or not. This isn't a fringe scenario. This is how real estate actually behaves. Vacancy is normal. Repairs are normal. Bad tenants are normal. A boiler that dies in January is normal. And none of those things care about your investment thesis. The framework the book gives you is a best-case model dressed up as a general rule, and the gap between those two things is where people get hurt. Because when you're running on thin margins and something goes sideways, you don't just lose the upside, you lose the asset. The bank doesn't wait for your situation to improve. The debt keeps accruing, the payments keep coming, and if you can't cover them, the bank takes the property back and you're left with nothing to show for however many years of payments you already made. And if you want the most brutal example of what happens when an entire market runs on this good debt logic without accounting for the downside, look at 2008. As housing prices declined, investors reported significant losses. Falling prices also resulted in homes worth less than the mortgage loans, providing borrowers with a financial incentive to enter foreclosure. And that's a polite way of describing what was actually a catastrophic unwinding. During 2006, 22% of homes purchased were for investment purposes, with an additional 14% purchased as vacation homes. During 2005, those figures were 28% and 12%, respectively, meaning a record level of nearly 40% of homes purchased were not intended as primary residences. That's not a housing market. That's a leverage machine running at full speed with no one watching the gauges. From September 2008 to September 2012, there were approximately 4 million completed foreclosures in the U.S. Think about what that number actually means. 4 million completed foreclosures. These weren't all reckless gamblers. A lot of them were people who had read exactly the kind of logic the book teaches. Buy real estate, use debt to leverage it, let the income cover the loan, and it worked perfectly, right up until it didn't. The framework wasn't wrong in the good years, but the framework had no answer for what happens when the whole market moves against you at once. The ultimate underlying cause of the foreclosure crisis was the emergence of a significant housing price bubble and its subsequent collapse. And bubbles don't announce themselves. They feel like momentum right up until they feel like a floor giving out. The people who got wiped out in 2008 weren't mostly making wild, reckless bets. A lot of them were following a completely rational-sounding framework. Buy real estate with debt, cover the debt with rental income, build equity over time. That's not crazy. That's almost word for word what the book teaches. The problem wasn't the logic. The problem was that the logic assumed a world where prices keep going up and tenants keep paying, and the world stopped cooperating with that assumption basically overnight. Leverage that multiplies gains, multiplies losses at exactly the same speed. The book doesn't say that clearly enough. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because the author himself isn't a clean example of his own system working flawlessly. In 2012, Rich Global LLC filed for bankruptcy and was ordered to pay $23.7 million to the Learning Annex over a royalty dispute. At bankruptcy, the company had $26 million in liabilities and $1.8 million in assets. Kiyosaki is not bankrupt in his personal capacity, even though some of his companies have gone bankrupt. And to be fair, that's actually a sophisticated move, using corporate structure to separate personal assets from business liabilities. But it does raise a question worth sitting with. The man who built a brand on teaching people to run financially sound businesses, using debt intelligently, had his own company go bankrupt with nearly $26 million in liabilities and $1.8 million in assets. In January 2024, Kiyosaki stated he was more than $1 billion in debt. He justified this by saying, "If I go bust, the bank goes bust, not my problem." This stance conflicts with his published advice about financial responsibility and raises questions about the sustainability of his philosophy for average investors. His response when asked about it? In his world, the bigger the debt, the bigger the leverage. If you owe $1 billion and can't pay it back, well, it's the bank's problem. Now that might be true at his scale. With his asset base, his income streams, his team of accountants and attorneys. Kiyosaki's playbook requires confidence, education, and a high tolerance for risk. Not everyone wants or needs a billion-dollar bet on their balance sheet. And that's actually Kiyosaki himself saying that, not just critics. He's acknowledged in interviews that most people can't handle debt the way he does, which is a pretty significant caveat to bury after selling 44 million copies of a book that makes the whole thing sound pretty accessible. Critics note he has made most of his money from selling his brand and seminars, rather than from the investment strategies he teaches. That's worth understanding not as a gotcha, but as context. The version of this framework that works at Kiyosaki's level comes with infrastructure most readers don't have. Legal teams, accountants, diversified income streams, and enough existing assets that one bad deal doesn't take everything down with it. When a regular person reads the book and decides to go buy a rental property with a mortgage, they're running the same play with a fraction of the margin for error. And that gap, between what the framework looks like at his level and what it looks like for a regular person trying it for the first time, is exactly what the book doesn't bridge. So where does that leave you? Because I don't want to just poke holes in a framework without giving you something more useful to walk away with. Here's the reframe. Good debt isn't a category. It's a risk calculation. The real question to ask isn't, is this good debt or bad debt? The real question is, can I survive if this income stream stops for 6 months? Can I cover the mortgage on this rental property out of pocket if it sits vacant? Do I have enough cash reserves that a bad quarter doesn't turn into a foreclosure? If the answer is yes, the debt might genuinely work for you. If the answer is no, it doesn't matter how good the debt looks on paper. You're one bad month away from the leverage working against you instead of for you. And here's a practical way to think about it. Before you take on any debt to buy an income-producing asset, run through 3 things. First, what's the worst realistic scenario for this income stream? Not catastrophic, just realistic. Vacancy, rate increases, a bad repair, a tenant who stops paying. Second, how long can you cover the debt payments out of pocket if that scenario plays out? If the answer is less than 6 months, your margin is too thin. Third, Is the debt structured so that your downside is limited? Or are you personally on the hook for everything? Those three questions don't make the decision for you, but they tell you whether you're actually ready for the risk you're about to take on. The book teaches you to think about assets and liabilities. What it underteaches is how much margin you actually need to use debt safely. Margin isn't just nice to have. It's what separates the people who build wealth with leverage from the people who get wiped out by it. The difference between a smart use of debt and a devastating one often isn't the deal itself. It's how much runway you had when the deal stopped performing the way you expected. And that runway, cash reserves, backup income, low personal overhead, is something you build before you take on leverage, not something you scramble to find after things go sideways. Kiyosaki's core argument that financial education matters more than income is validated by research. Key financial literacy components include budgeting, planning, and making wise investment decisions. And studies confirm that financial illiteracy increases the likelihood of unsustainable debt and poor planning. So, the underlying message of the book, that you need to understand money better than the average person, is genuinely sound. The issue is that the book sometimes makes the tools sound simpler and more reliable than they actually are in practice. Good debt is real. It works. But it works the way any powerful tool works. Well, when you know what you're doing and have room to absorb mistakes, and badly when you don't. If this video gave you a different way of looking at the book, drop a comment. I'm curious whether you think the framework is still useful even with the gaps, or whether the gaps are big enough to matter. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this channel is building a series on the books and ideas that shaped how people think about money. So subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Because here's where we're going next. Kiyosaki got a generation of people thinking about debt differently, and that part was genuinely valuable. But there's another story about what happens when that exact thinking scales up across an entire economy, when everyone believes the asset will keep going up, when the leverage gets so layered that nobody can see the bottom of it anymore. That story is The Big Short. And it's the clearest picture you'll ever see of what the good debt logic looks like when it goes catastrophically wrong at scale. That one's coming up next.